Hello, and welcome to another session of the Stafford Beer Brain of the Firm reading group with General Intellect Unit. And today we will be covering Chapter 19, The End of the Beginning. So, Beer's comment at the start of the section here is that... in Chapter 19, the story of the whole development of Cybersyn through that sort of initial period of the revolution that Beer was involved in is concluded. There seems little point in offering further analysis here, in summary of a chronicle which steadily unfolds itself in the text. So, yeah. No need to summarize, let's just get to it. January is high summer in Santiago, the 1 month when people who can afford it decamp to the coast or to the mountains to leave a capital that is like an English summer for the rest of the year, and people say, don't worry, it is too hot for revolutions. On the 10th of January 1973, I spent all day sweltering in the operations room, supervising changes to the Checo screen apparatus, which was not animating properly. Nonetheless, there it all was. The room existed. Of course, it was not running the Chilean economy, but it was the last of the 4 Cybersyn tools to be ready. It was a viable transducer. Only the linkages remained to be made. In the next few days, I prepared an inaugural speech for the president, and also a very long explanation of the arrangement of the room and its purposes, which was intended to be recorded for all the visitors that were waiting to come from every level of recursion. It was this fact that gave rise to considerable disagreement between several of us about the Spanish language version. Were we really talking to ministers, parliamentarians, senior officials, bureaucrats, workers' committees, or the people themselves? And if to them all, as was strictly intended, in what order? Meanwhile, and simultaneously, there was yet another major change of emphasis on the political front. For complex constitutional reasons, the ministers of economics and finance had changed places. Cybersyn especially was clearly related to Corfo, a branch of economics. We had already said that its tools were ready to be handed over, and all the personnel belonged to Corfo as paymaster. But Fernando Flores was now Minister of Finance, and he continued to be the political director of all our cybernetics. So far as I knew, I was still the scientific director. Thus, there began a new series of demands on the core group, which had almost no relevance to the prior history. The strain was telling on everyone. 2 key people were confined to bed for the whole of January and most of February too. The president, as I spoke to him once, though unofficially in January, seemed more relaxed than anyone, despite the imminence of the March elections. The point about these was crucial. If the vote for Allende fell from 36% to less than a third, he would be constitutionally compelled to resign, and certainly he would have acquiesced in that. Given all the difficulties since October, such a result seemed a plausible outcome. But Mario Grandi made a detailed political analysis which suggested that the Unidad Popular vote would actually increase to at least 40%. In the event, it was 43%, and it is surely a terrifying conjecture for democracy that an increase of 7% in popular support might sign the death warrant of any administration. So we are on now to the cybernetics of public accountability. It is against this background that we come to consider the whole question of announcements, of which the inauguration of the operations room was intended to be the first. It is first of all necessary to distinguish between the various publics to which such schemes as these are accountable. Foremost of these is the public who will be actively involved in the scheme. As explained in earlier chapters, we had aimed for participative management of both Project Cybersyn via workers' committees and individual advisors, and the People Project via the political parties and the arts connections. Be it noted, though, however, that the customarily fine balance between the leadership of a participating group and the dragooning of consenting assistants, which causes difficulty in every presidential office type of organization, is further sharpened by the use of innovative technology. Because the would-be participants do not know what the opportunities are until these novelties have been explained, and it is difficult, if only because of enthusiasm and the need to overcome psychological and intellectual inertia, not to exert pressure in the process. Even so, the members of the whole participative group involved in setting objectives and taking decisions have direct access to each other. Cybernetically, the network connecting them is anastomotic and not hierarchic. It is in principle capable of generating requisite variety, and it should exhibit the redundancy of potential command, see Chapter 15. It is easy from within such a network to perceive when these multinodal characteristics are being lost. The symptom is for the network to tend to centralize, so that actions increasingly become referred to one dominant person, and secondly, for one person, not necessarily the same person, but one responding directly to him, to act as gatekeeper between the group and the outside world. Not at all surprisingly, these tendencies ebb and flow in strong correlation with the degrees of stress. In normal managerial circumstances, some one person is known to be ultimately accountable for the group's activity, but in placid conditions he is, quote-unquote, the boss, and the quotation marks are audible in spoken parlance. While as matters become stressful, he becomes capital T, capital B, the boss, and the capital letters are audible too. The cybernetics of the multinode show this to be perfectly acceptable insofar as the greater the stress, the more likely it is that the boss rather than anyone else has the information needed to relieve it, because he has the better contacts among his own organizational peers, so the potential command is momentarily realized in him. The caveat is, of course, that when placid conditions return, the boss must again become lowercase the boss, which is something he may forget to do, having got into the bossy habit. Other members of the group then have certain duties to the boss and to the group which are difficult to discharge. I have experienced the difficulty in both the roles concerned more than once. The last paragraph, as its final sentence is intended to show, is a generalization based on fitting experience into the cybernetic framework of a viable System 5. It was well borne out in the Chilean work, but it was handled successfully by the group. A test for this success can be proposed. Consider the mismatch existing at any given time between the bossiness of the boss in a participative group and the degree of external stress that generates the bossiness through the realization of potential command. If the mismatch grows over a period, the danger signals in the network's homeostats will be steadily amplified by positive feedback until, maybe, homeostasis breaks down. It sounds something like this. Look what he's done. Now look what he's done. I could see this coming all the time. He's mad, I tell you. I resign. You're fired, as the case may be. Whole management groups have been seen to explode into fragments by this process, which obviously ought to be constrained. Because of the stress, such a process often started in the Chilean cybernetic network. But in 2 years, the names of only 3 actual casualties occur to me. One who resigned, one who was fired, and one who was, as it were, extruded by mutual consent. The test is more qualitative than quantitative. The group did not explode, its attrition was natural. All right, what do people have to say about this? Let's go to Shane and then Jake.
It's interesting that this is putting a kind of name to a dynamic that seems to show up over and over again all throughout nature, right? Like, on under stress, group animals, like social animals like wolves, will go insane and start acting very hierarchically. And that's what led people to believe that wolves were extremely hierarchical. But it was only because they were observed in either situations where Europeans were fucking with them or in captivity, in which case the animals revert to a hierarchical, like a regression sort of happens, right? Whereas when they're in their natural habitat, they're all very networky and fluid in their dynamics, et cetera, et cetera. We see the same thing again, like in the Roman dictatorship. Like, you have an ordinarily fairly complex sort of governance structure that collapses, it deliberately collapses, in fact, into, putting a boss in charge for a short period of time to get over a hump, and then dissolves that again. So there's a back and forth. And this is interesting that Beer is putting all this in terms of the realization of potential command, because the multi-node, like from those previous chapters, is all about the redundancy of potential command. It's the distributed, deeply interconnected nature of the network that allows the potential for command to arise from anywhere. But under pressure, there's a selection pressure towards actualizing the potential command and making it be real right now rather than possibly be real tomorrow. And in the absence of pressure to the contrary, that will just collapse into boss stuff. And maybe the one other sort of thing I'm thinking of here is the kind of anthropological stuff about like how pre-capitalist societies, or like seem to put a lot of effort into preventing bosses from emerging. Like they have potlatch ceremonies to burn off surplus. You have all these kind of intricate rituals to prevent hierarchical, centralized domination from emerging. But then once it does emerge, once the tyrant does become actual, that becomes a self-perpetuating bootstrapping process that snowballs from there. So it's interesting that like we do see in a couple of different places these like animals and societies and systems try to not let this happen, but it does still happen under pressure. And ideally, it would be kind of nice if like something like the Roman dictatorship, where there'd be a formal process for, okay, it's an emergency scenario, you're in charge for the next month, and then we're back to normal, etc. It's nice to see the cybernetics behind all that,
Yeah, I mean, it's also the way that generalships worked in Athens during its democratic period, where it was it was an emergency appointment that had sort of dictatorial powers, and then it was given the boot.
I guess there's something interesting here that like you could, if you have a formal process for that, like Athens or Rome, you can do this transition back and forth. Well, hopefully, so long as they don't try to rat fuck you, once they're a dictator. But this was successfully navigated a couple of times. But in the absence of that kind of structure, and in the absence of counter pressure to pressure away from the centralization, this natural dynamic will just latch. It'll take, and it'll stick. You kind of really need some formalized way of countering this.
I agree, and I do want to raise the sort of counterpoint from the anthropology that Graeber brought up in that one paper that we read, which was that according to him and sort of his affiliated anthropologists, there was a sort of ebb and flow of tyranny that happened in pre-modern, not even pre-modern, pre-civilized societies, where there's evidence of sort of monumental constructions, but then that would go away, and there would be evidence of more sort of egalitarian societies, and then it would come back to tyranny again. So it's not necessarily the case that there's a natural tendency towards sticking in the dictatorial mode.
Gotcha.
But who knows what happened between let's all build a big monument to me and nah, fuck that, we're gonna build like public housing, right? Like,
yeah, cool. Yeah, I've kind of forgotten that paper. Yeah,
yeah. Who knows what the mechanisms were? We have no idea. All we have is like some very rudimentary archaeological evidence. Okay, let's go to Jake, and then Rudy, and then Matt.
Yeah, there's definitely like, this dynamic of like, well, we're all stressed. A lot of stuff's happening. Not sure what to do, and then it's like defer to whoever has the most experience or whoever. Sometimes just whoever is willing to be like, yeah, let's just fucking do this. And then everyone's like, I guess we'll just do this. It's like, and I like how he kind of describes it as, it's like kind of the person who has the best connection to these disparate parts of the organization. And I think it's also, it's a thing that comes about due to these lack of formalized structures for distributing the information and distributing the connections in the network to different people, or to technology that doesn't rely on like a person being suitable to make the connections. Because that's definitely something that I've encountered a lot, where, the connection that I have to one part of this network is a person, and then that person gets stressed or they have a lot of work to do and they can't be that connection. And then whatever I was trying to do that involved that part, it just has to be put on pause or whatever, which is very frustrating for sure. And it can lead to a lot of like destabilization of the structures that are put in place. And I think this is also, you see this on the left a lot of like substitutionism, right? Of like people, especially like in leadership positions, substituting themselves for like the work of membership, which has the feedback of concentrating more more knowledge and experience in the same people who have it, so then that doesn't lead to building leadership and stuff. So, and that's like, again, it's like these structures that need to be put in place, or should be put in place rather, like to prevent this, especially when things are frantic, like now, it can be a little tough to make that case to people that aren't sort of thinking of it in that like framework, of like, well, these things are necessary. And it's not just a factor of like, well, it'll be nice to have these, but it's like, if these aren't in place, then it could very easily lead to like a destabilizing thing. I mean, like, I won't get into the specifics, but in one of the organizing projects I'm involved in, it's just like there are like 5 people who are doing all of the work, and I've been trying to be like, hey, we need to be better about spreading this out, about like getting more people involved, and people are on board, but it's just like similarly, right? Like there's these structures aren't in place. So because of the stress that's put on the people and the system, there is no way of pushing that stuff out more. And it's just like a matter of figuring out how to do that, like on an individual level. And yeah, I think I like that he kind of like really names this, and I can only imagine how much stress they were under in Chile to get this stuff like to figure this out.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point here, right? Is that they're in a high stress revolutionary situation, and there's still a kind of oscillation between centralized centralized and kind of I guess actualized and redundant control would be the best way to put it. So it's clearly not the message here is clearly not, oh, once you get into a revolutionary situation, you just want a dictatorship because it's an emergency situation. And then once the revolutionary situation is over, then you get rid of the dictatorship. That's not what's going on here. It's quite a bit more fine-grained than that, even though, Beer recognizes the need for actualization of control in certain circumstances. Matt, go ahead.
I think it's interesting that the who winds up as sort of dictator, it kind of winds up being decided by like the peripheral connections, which, I think is something that's super interesting that Beer is always very mindful of, that, when these structures aren't working, part of what makes it a viable system is that there is always a backup. It is always just, kind of like the very like low level, like social dynamics like that. And, there's kind of like something to that, I think of like when I've had a good manager or whatever, but part of it was that like they were connected to lots of different parts of the endeavor and like knew the different meta languages and like already had like working relationships with a bunch of people. And, that's probably like a complicated thing to maybe, if we're going to get rid of the social division of labor, like that isn't necessarily something you can easily teach. There may be something like the synchrony thingy that Beer likes. Maybe that helps do that. And then, also want to mention, when it comes to like the avoiding, like this state, the equilibrium of the dictatorship that never ends. Like, and they were just, like pre-modern peoples were like really aware of this. Like I'm thinking of in the book of in the book of Samuel in the Bible, like before then, they had the judges that got raised up, whenever like there was need for it, and then they ask for a king, and then God tells them that this is a terrible idea, like he's going to steal from you, he's going to be terrible, but fine. and they were like even aware of like there is a version of this that there's no coming back from, that like that is just the state. And I think it's also like a response like increasing complexity, like if your original model like doesn't really work anymore, like like Rome's Republic fell because like it was governing like way too much territory basically, like you needed to fall back on this kind of sort of a like energetically favorable state. I'm also thinking of even the commune state giving way to the party state. I think the commune state is actually kind of a bad idea. Maybe something more like a bourgeois government with separation of powers and everything actually gives you the requisite variety. And I haven't like looked into it too much, but like I think part of why the party could actually govern while the commune state didn't was just like not having like those that internal like structural variety that like allowed you to govern anything. Obviously, the party state didn't really work, but like there's a reason why the commune state like gave way to this sort of like natural, kind of like low energy, version of it.
I mean, we have to be realistic about having some kind of organization, because if you look at the Paris Commune, basically you had Blanquists taking over the situation towards the end there, right? And this idea that it was like, left to its own devices, it would just sort of perfectly blossom into communism, is really quite absurd, considering, there was a clear tendency within the Paris Commune for the most organized group, which was the Blanquists, to take power. So organization matters. Definitely. So Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, that spontaneous stuff is like a Boltzmann brain theory of revolution, right? Where like just like a fully formed brain will just spontaneously just pop into existence somewhere in the void and then instantly decay. It's not that it's impossible, but it's unlikely. Maybe this another throwaway thought here is, we're maybe thinking about this, ebb and flow between potential command and like actual command, or like that sort of stuff in contemporary terms of like what's going on in bourgeois politics right now, right? Like it's possible that like the bourgeoisie have been able to coast for a couple of decades on fairly distributed, like a soft authority sort of way of controlling things via finance and markets and all that other horseshit, and now that they're under pressure, where you're just seeing this like hard authority, and the sort of strongman stuff reemerging, and it's probably what's going on here too.
Right, and I mean, the thing about the connectedness of leadership, I mean, it is, in a sense, it's very clearly what gave the advantage to Biden over Sanders in the Democratic leadership race, right, is that Biden was much better connected to people who had power than Sanders was, and was, Biden's people were able to just mobilize a united opposition to Sanders and win the race because those connections existed and they're very powerful. It's not to say that that's absolutely determinative of outcomes, but as far as like organizational dynamics go, that does check out with what Beer is describing here. And it's also, why Stalin beat Trotsky, right? Is he was a more personable person, and he actually had connections to people, whereas Trotsky was an arrogant asshole who was famous, but was not that well connected and didn't really care to be because he had disdain for most other people he met. Anyway, that all being the case, Matt, go ahead.
Just one last thing on connectedness. I'm reminded today of this data science blogger who basically used social network analysis to predict who was going to be the next premier leader of China, and he successfully predicted it was going to be Xi Jinping because he was the best on two different metrics, both connectivity in general, he was connected to the most people, and also intergroup connectivity. So you've got clusters of people who are connected to each other, but not really connected to other clusters. More of those clusters flowed through him than anyone else. And based on those two things, this guy figured he was going to be the next premier leader. And he was.
Yeah, I feel like this mode of analysis is very good for sort of Kremlinology, that kind of highly insider power dynamics. It's quite good for that. The wild card is always that there is an organized force that intrudes from outside the organization, right? But as far as predicting who is going to win within a established organizational structure, I think it's really quite useful, for sure. Okay, so let's continue. Next, we come to consider the public that is not directly affected, those who are represented, therefore, by participation, but who are affected indirectly, and in this case, the entire Chilean nation, insofar as these plans intended to change managerial modes of government. Again, then, in this case, there is no method whereby requisite variety can be obtained, except through external amplifiers that are outside the control of the sponsors of the work. This comment refers outstandingly to the political opposition. Remembering that Unidad Popular was a minority government, and remembering the case already submitted in these chapters that the cybernetic group was working as a management service to that government, it would make no sense whatever to invite participation from the political opposition. As already remarked, there were political opponents working inside the projects as a matter of professional freedom, but they were not there to represent their party's causes. Had they been, no consensus would have ever been reached about anything. I refer again to the opening arguments of Chapter 16, but do not repeat them here. It follows that the law of requisite variety can be met only through amplifiers capable of reaching the whole nation, and not only the minority of the nation as represented in participative project management. Such amplifiers are usually referred to as the mass media, and in Chile, these were heavily dominated by outspoken opposition interests. This analysis pinpoints a dilemma. It would have been cybernetically wrong, even if it had not been unethical, to try to keep the work a secret, because of the counterproductive consequences of attempting to thwart Ashby's law. The law always reasserts itself, and if the mode of amplification, in this case from 40 to 100%, equals times 2.5, were not properly designed, then the government initiatives were likely to be overwhelmed. A 2.5 times discrepancy in variety matching hardly lies within experimental error. So the 40 to 100% is the 40% who voted for Unidad Popular, or rather for the government. I think, that was the vote for Unidad Popular. And then the 100% being the entire population, or the entire voting population. But the amplifiers could not be designed since they were under the opposition's control. This being so, we had neither sought secrecy for the work nor attempted to advertise it, and this was surely the best policy. Up to this point, early in 1973, we went about our business, just circumspectly. Even to do this presented problems. Large numbers of people were involved in our activities, including political opponents, although not in the core group as I called it before. My own presence in a government office quickly drew attention, and therefore I left it. For the whole of 1972, I worked out of the biggest hotel in Santiago, unnoticed among the celebrities, Chilean and foreign, who were continuously in occupation. But the work was based in Corfo, which was entirely appropriate so long as Flores was in economics. And we were dealing directly with the industrial economy rather than with agencies spotlighted as planning or policy making, which moreover were regarded as the sectarian property of individual parties within popular unity. In this way, the force of the Ashbean dilemma was deflected for more than a year. But it is always dangerous to tamper with natural laws, and we were alert to the need to take the initiative in redressing the variety balance at the propitious time. We defined this as the official launching of Cybersyn via the inauguration of the operations room. Alternatively, we knew that we needed to act quickly if these matters came to public attention. Meanwhile, silence rather than secrecy was enough, because the media were very slow indeed to catch on to the importance of the work. But as it turned out, they were inconveniently too fast by just 1 month, as shall be seen. Returning once again to January 10th in the operations room, it was clear that the propitious time for announcements to the larger public was drawing nigh. These announcements stood to be radically perverted by the opposition-dominated media. The Flores solution to this had for a long time been that I should make an announcement about Cybersyn in England, and at the same time as the Chilean government spoke in Santiago. The idea could be viewed, in public relations terms, as an attempted escalation in credibility, London supporting Santiago, and vice versa. Cybernetically, it was of course an attempt to regulate the amplification process that was not under control in Chile. The hope was that by enlarging the Chilean public to the world government public, a more objective media treatment on an international scale would insist that the Chilean media held substantially to the truth. The machinery was this. I had been asked to deliver the Richard Goodman Memorial Lecture for 1973 at the Brighton Polytechnic in England. Goodman had been a brilliant cybernetician and a dear friend, but I had felt preoccupied by the Chilean work, and originally contemplated making excuses, at least for that year. Suddenly, the invitation became exactly the right medium through which to make the Cybersyn announcement in England. It was the occasion par excellence. Richard Goodman had been dedicated to the underprivileged. He had fought in the Spanish Civil War, and thereafter he had devoted his work to ordinary teaching in a college well known for its third world student intake, spurning high academic honors. Had he still lived, he would surely have taken sabbatical leave to join me in Chile. Everything fitted together. What a celebration! it was still January 10th. The Richard Goodman Memorial Lecture had by now been fixed for February 14th. On Sunday, January 7th, the science correspondent of the British Observer newspaper, Nigel Hawkes, published an article entitled "Chile Run by Computer." The article gave its own source, the underground science newsletter Eddies, published in London. The Observer article correctly reported me as somewhat taken aback at the disclosure, and said that I should be giving more details in Brighton mid-February. Meanwhile, however, it is noteworthy that the Observer preempted the whole story without a detailed interview. I was taken aback only by telephone. This is called a scoop. It thereby set the whole tone of subsequent reportage. Not so much by the article itself as by its title. Woe to sub-editors. By Monday the 15th, less than a month before the Brighton assignment, the Observer article had been widely noticed, and a cabinet meeting in Santiago considered the original leak, plus its Latin American copies and speculative elaborations in Colombia, Argentina, and Chile itself. In Valparaiso. The story had been printed in Eddies in the first place as a result of what I had told a political group in London in the attempt to gain help for the activities earlier called externalities. There had been a misunderstanding about confidentiality on one man's part. Nothing, not even the most expensive public relations program, can generate the requisite variety needed to regulate the media worldwide. All such attempts have fortunately always failed, and will continue to do so as long as free speech is anywhere allowed. Our plans had gone wrong. I gave very strong advice that the government should immediately make a full-scale and high-level press presentation of Cybersyn, with a televised tour of the operations room, in order to amplify the government side of the variety equation to the full. The counter-argument was that the place would then need 20 armed guards to resist sabotage by the opposition, not to mention the vulnerability of the hundreds of input stations spread over 3,000 miles of country. Various decisions were reached and then rescinded at least once a day throughout the week. Many other things were happening, notably a copper strike. At any rate, the initiative in the Battle of Ashby's Law for Project Cybersyn was lost that week. The story had already been filed, as far as the British media were concerned. There was no support, nor extra information coming out of Santiago, as had been planned. I left for Europe after an extremely friendly and particularly useful meeting with the minister, during which this issue was virtually disregarded. Nothing was going to be done about it, obviously, and there was so much else to be done about the other limbs of our work, especially in the circumstances that realists now knew for certain that the administration would not be allowed to run its full term. He gave me a new brief in this regard. But one thing relevant to Cybersyn still had to happen, namely the delivery of the Goodman Memorial Lecture itself on February 14th, 1973. That did happen. The address itself, called Fanfare for Effective Freedom, is printed in extenso in Platform for Change. Present on this occasion was the Chilean ambassador to London. Absent on this occasion was any one of the 20 scoop journalists invited by the Goodman trustees. The questions that afterwards were mostly elementary, save for those of one well-informed academic who wanted full details of the relationship of Project Cybersyn to all the planning agencies in Santiago. Naturally, the reasons have already been given in these chapters. I could not go beyond saying that the work came under the aegis of Corfo. During March, I was engaged in externalities matters around Europe and was not in Chile again until April. By this time, Cybersyn had been praised to the skies and damned to hell by a variety of critics. The details are of no concern to the cybernetics of public accountability, consisting as they do of the usual mixture of carefully considered reviews and ad hominem assaults. The latter coming exclusively from two British journals which take a special pride in scientific and social responsibility, but which, perhaps for that very reason, reduce themselves on this occasion to hysteria. This section is concerned only to point out how the attempt to regulate not the media, but the design of the government's own amplification system failed. and especially how, once such a transducer had become denatured, then, as with a neuron that cannot respond during its refractory period, nothing happens at all. For this was the cybernetic truth. The battle of Ashby's Law for the reputation of Project Cybersyn had, as we said earlier, been lost in advance. The algorithmic signal constituted by the immediate effects of the first major leak on January 7th had been ignored. That was the cardinal error. What happened in April in Santiago was not an error. It was the natural reaction of a denatured transducer. Not only was there all the published evidence to consider, not only was there a question of the efficacy of the project to consider, not only was so much else happening at the time, the academic member of the Richard Goodman audience whom I had perforce turned aside chose this moment to make a vitriolic personal denunciation through a private channel open to her, which led straight to the cabinet. This attack nearly finished me in Chile. That it did not was due to the support of the man who had fetched me to Chile in the first place, aided, I suppose, by the general knowledge at the cabinet level that at least some of the accusations that had been made in odium academica were manifestly false. All of this argues that public accountability can be discharged locally, which because the local system can be designed to exercise requisite variety. This means that the negentropy pump called information can successfully offset the entropic drift towards disorganization by invoking the basic cybernetic principles of the multinode as already discussed. Secondly, it argues that on some larger scale, the capacity to deploy requisite variety is lost, because control of the design of the amplifiers of regulatory variety is lost. In the Chilean case, this happened, for political reasons, at the national level. Thirdly, it argues that by engaging in a yet higher level of recursion, and in this case the international level of governmental systems, negentropy can in principle be pumped back into the intermediate, i.e. national level of recursion, but that this is a very difficult maneuver to handle. In principle, one does not have requisite variety to handle it, and the only recourse is to be exceptionally alert to algorithmic warnings of disaster. These, to conclude, were missed in the presentation of the Chilean cybernetics applications, possibly because my colleagues thought, if so erroneously, that the danger signals were hurt pride in masquerade. Much more plausibly because there were too many other things to do, and certainly because there was no organizational apparatus for handling algorithmic signals outside those built into the social economy regulation itself. We had not got that far. All right, let's talk about this. Jeremy, and then Shane, and then Jake.
Beer's going to go back to this idea that the media plays with the variety of systems in Chapter 20 in much more detail. But it's worth considering that people can shoot out messages with shitty information that totally fuck up your organization, even if they don't know anything. They can come up with a plausible narrative at any point that derail things, and that as a weapon gets used all the time. And as just, I mean, at some point there's a blurring between whether someone said something because they're stupid or someone said something because they're malicious, and it's not really relevant. People can put out detrimental information and have that cycle extraordinarily quickly. I don't think this is a problem Beer solves, but by pointing to it, he shows all of our projects are susceptible to this, especially because we need to get that information out there to support us, and those, by exposing ourselves, by trying to drum up support for what we're doing, we're also exposing ourselves to being shot down by media, PR, propaganda actors who can just take pot shots at us in places we can't fight back.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot help I cannot help in reading this be reminded of the disaster of anti-Semitism investigations in the Labour Party that torpedoed Corbyn and ultimately has kicked him out of the party. Both because this involves intra-left backstabbing, and also because it involves the British media.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth taking into consideration that the day that before the election was called, there were centrist Democrats like Connor Lamb and Abigail Spanberger, ex-CIA Abigail Spanberger, who began attacking AOC, Black Lives Matter, police abolition, before they even knew the results of the election, claiming that that's the reason why Democrats lost seats in the House,
yes,
causing AOC and other people to shoot back. And then immediately the original narrative was AOC tries to be divisive, shooting down the Democratic Party. If it hadn't been for people like Beto O'Rourke and Doug Jones having her back and reiterating her message, it could have been a lot nastier.
Right. There was definitely a power play made there, especially when the exit poll information was quite unclear. I mean, certainly I feel a certain degree of regret about our post-election coverage of what happened in America because we were going off of the information we had, and that information was quite misleading as to what actually happened. I would say one other thing, though, which is that the other way this reminds me of the Corbyn case is that, we don't really know exactly what the organizational history was while Corbyn was in power and why, or what was done about those investigations. But it feels like a similar sort of situation where there's probably a whole bunch of internal organizational pressures that are confounding an effective result. Okay, so everyone's got their hands up. I'm gonna go. Let's go counterclockwise. We'll start with Mark O, and then go around. Or sorry, clockwise.
Okay, cool. All right, yeah. Jeremy kind of hit what I was getting to, but I was just thinking of a contrast, and not necessarily. Although obviously your example is good, but I'm just thinking can you trust anything you see in U.S. or British media about a Latin American leftist government or news out of Syria? So even though this case seems to be somebody found out about it and they didn't like it because computers or whatever, it's but Beer still had the trust, well, if we get our message out there, it'll be good. Whereas the information warfare has gotten so much more sophisticated in the ensuing decades that it's just it's just looking back oh, he could think that. I mean, people still think that, but they really shouldn't. So, but then as Jeremy said, we'll get into that more, the whole news cycle issue in the final chapter. But I mean, this just shows even if that was if it was just a couple cranky people, then obviously they knew what was going to happen in Chile that the opposition was going to seize on it. So it didn't really matter. It didn't have to be some, paid actor from some Bellingcat type organization.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the media landscape these days is a lot more complicated than it was at that time because, yes, the sophistication of PSYOPs was less developed than it is today, but at the same time, the number of media outlets was very small at the national international level. At the local level, it was actually a lot more diverse, but when you look at the national international level, it was very, very small. So especially in the case of Britain, I think it was very much organized as an old boys club and especially tied to like former military personnel, I think, were a lot of what tied together the media landscape in Britain. And I think Beer was relying on being a member of that old boys club to help him get his message out, but he was not able to effectively do that. But I think like that's what I read. Having read about the media history in Britain, I think that's probably his play that he was trying to make.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Okay, so let's go to Rudy.
Yeah, on that topic, that's why you end up having things like Telesur or Chavez. Chavez is usually made fun of or criticized for just having like his 1 hour programs every week. But people forget the reason Chavez said he wants to talk 1 hour is that they could hear him for 1 hour without any intermediaries. And, this is a bit like, it's kind of sad, that public television is somehow seen as brainwashing. I'm not saying it isn't, but it was a natural response to private media. Say like, well, this is our government. We are going to control the messaging in this. And it's, everything gets corrupted the same way like parliamentary immunity was meant to prevent frivolous lawsuits against workers. And now it's just another tool for corruption. So it always seems like you have to catch up with the game, right?
Yeah, I think we'll have to talk about Telesur when we do get to Beer's comments about mass media, because it seems like sort of left to their own devices that like a media outlet of a similar type, if not the same sort of like, extremely message control oriented propagandistic organization like Telesur is something that like Beer was driving for with his like efforts to get documentaries made, for his efforts to get movies made, for his efforts to get songs to be put out, and his advocacy for like, places where they could amplify their variety and get their messaging out, and also sort of like integrate the population at large into the cybernetic apparatus that they were trying to create a sort of linkage. So I don't know if they would have ended up with something exactly like Telesur, but there's no question that Beer was kind of driving in the direction of having a media outlet that was not overwhelmingly controlled by the opposition. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that just to add a little bit more on this. Like, one thing I've always been struggling with throughout this, right, is that I feel like there's some level of, well, predictability or regularity, or in the case of the media, sort of good faith that Beer is relying on here. Because like when you have this situation where people are blatantly injecting blatantly contradictory information, right? Like, how do you possibly navigate that space to be able to control the variety in the signals here, right? So, like, when you have a situation with, Trump, obviously, or all of the stuff with the Democrat CIA ops blaming the left, right, for their message, you're working in a space where there's just as much, if not more, false information there that completely prevents you from actually like being able to look at the variety that's generated and control or operate in that space in any sort of meaningful way, right? Because it will either push you in the wrong directions, or you'll just end up with like every outcome is equally, you're in the full sort of entropic situation where like everything is just as equal as anything else, or even in the malicious sense, like the wrong actual understanding of the state of the system is being amplified. And like, I think of things like, the mass media, both siderisms, which is specifically like amplifying wrong information and attenuating, possibly correct information. So like all of these things which are directly interfering with being able to like get a foothold in how the system actually is, worries me about all of this, right? Because, with that, it's not just a matter of finding like statistical regularities, because like false data is injected into the system at an overwhelming rate. And I don't know how to get around that. I mean, certainly like it comes into play more so with the media, but there's always going to be malicious or incompetent actors, as Jeremy was saying. It doesn't matter, regardless of your system, but like clearly in the media domain, it is prevalent. And yeah, it's troublesome, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think everything's lost, because like you look at what happened in Bolivia, and it's like, the New York Times is still trying to paint the return of Morales as like, some Imperial March playing, Darth Vader has arrived. Everyone is horrified, like the dark days have come. But, his party still won the damn election. And what was it now? I guess he was able to survive the coup because of Mexican assistance was a big part of that. Got a flight out of there on a Mexican military plane. So, it's not impossible to overcome these things, but very, very difficult. Very difficult. Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely think, people are definitely right on the money about like the media generates a lot of variety, and especially now, like what was this, since Trump, like it's like the ultimate generator of like false variety, and just, well, maybe not generator, but the amplifying of it through social media is just insane, and as to like ways to fix that, I certainly don't think I have a magic bullet or anything, but I would think it would be more about trying to sort of bridge those gaps, like instead of there being this middleman that is the media between the people who aren't involved with the projects of, the revolutionary society or whatever, and the people who are, like bridging that gap, really connecting them on a more like personal level, or at least on a more personal level, not necessarily a personal level, because at that scale, right, it could, I don't know if that's possible, but in some sense, like you like whoever mentioned with like Che giving those speeches, it's like connecting people to like what's actually happening on the ground. Like I think that does a lot better. Thinking about kind of the organization I'm in, of we don't do a lot of social media. People don't really know about us unless they have a personal connection to someone who is doing the work, which in my mind is kind of better than social media, at least at this stage we're at, because you don't need all that false variety that gets generated when you sort of connect to social media, and you don't need the variety that gets generated by people who have like what's the word, like malicious motives, or like an incentive to see your project fail, whether even it's because they're in favor of capitalism, or because they just like have some personal like, oh, I don't like seeing this other group succeed while I'm not, which is unfortunately all too common. So I think definitely like managing that in a sense, but like at the scale that Beer was dealing with here, at a nation level, you can't keep stuff secret. You can't really. It's at some point, when it comes to like the massive stuff they're doing, and they're basically doing it on the tail end of when it was possible for that to conceivably be kept secret. Before smartphones were everywhere, before even video cameras became cheap enough to have, in a lot of homes. You could sort of not communicate what was happening in one country, and it wouldn't be, then no one would know about it unless they were in that country. But now it's impossible right now. The world is, I think, too globally connected, just on those like multiple levels of multiple system twos, I guess. And yeah, I also just like, I really like the framing of it, of sort of, the idea of like being scooped as introducing a massive amount of variety, and not the variety that you wanted, and not true, like not based on reality, like into the system that is dispensing this information, because I don't know, it's just an interesting way of thinking about it, and I kind of like that as a way to frame the problem of like, how do you communicate the work that you're doing? It's really, you got to frame it in like, is this going to introduce, it's like when someone's, when you get like doxxed by fascists, it's like you're introducing a lot of variety into your system, which is coming from people who have very different political beliefs than you that want to see you harm done to you. And that oscillates the whole system out of control, so it's like, you've got to clamp down on that, whatever, scrub your social media or whatever, and prevent that variety from worming its way into your system and kind of exploding all your feedback mechanisms.
Right. I mean, I think the obvious problem with sort of having direct connections between Cybersyn and the people it's serving was that it's a national scale project and needs to be addressed in that way. So, like, certainly they were working with people, like, openly, in a sense, right? Because they had the workers in all the places where Cybernet was connected that were working with this stuff. They had workers coming in for training. It wasn't a secret project as such. It was just not an advertised project. And I mean, I think Beer was basically correct that there needed to be some kind of messaging about the project, even if, it's like that went beyond the people who were immediately involved in it. Because it was an object of such importance, like, it's easy to present it as being what the left in Britain presented it as, is like a mechanism for tyranny, of just like cybernetic control of the population, like Amazon or something, or even like, there was that one article that came out recently about that one person who was working at Facebook dealing with censorship of political messaging, and she was saying, like, I felt really uncomfortable because I was operating without any accountability at all and basically having the power to sway elections one way or the other, depending on whose message I amplified and whose message I attenuated. That kind of thing is what the left in Britain was actually worried about, not Cybersyn. So, yeah, it's... I mean, I think it at the level of local organizing, you don't necessarily need to have a media strategy, or you don't need to have a media outreach. But I think Beer is correct in saying that when you get to a national or international level, you need some kind of amplification. It's got to be there, because there's just so many people involved that can't be directly hands-on involved in the project. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, first thing is that the fucking Brits, just a nation of fucking vipers and swine, without exception. They ruin fucking everything they're involved with. Yeah, I think, like, the solution to a lot of this stuff is just going to be, like, trust and familiarity, right? Like, I think a lot of these examples really highlight the problem of bourgeois, like, parliamentary politics as an alienated domain, right? Because, like, if you imagine, like, a parallel universe version of Chile at this time in which these sort of techniques had been deployed on the ground for decades or, like, for years, like, and the whole, like, left movement was kind of built on these things, and, like, this stuff was already familiar to Chileans and was already well permeated. Like, the British media could realistically go after the Cybersyn team and take them down, but it would have an impossible time somehow brainwashing all of Chile into believing something that would be contrary to their own personal experience. Like, they say, like, oh, this system is just a Skynet thing, and people are just like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, I know it. Like, we've been using it to organize our union. You know, it's just like this just doesn't smell like anything familiar to me. Or when I don't know, Trump is like, oh, I hear Bernie Sanders eats babies, and it's like, you know, people can be like, wow, geez, that sounds terrible, because, you know, it's like but like, if you're familiar with all these people and stuff and you actually trust them, it's like, no, that's fucking horseshit, right? Or like with the example of the anti-Semitism thing in the Labour Party, right? Like, I mean, the sort of better outcome of that is not like, oh, everybody closes ranks and just denies that, oh, this is obviously bourgeois interference. No, it would be like, no, yeah, like the Labour Party probably does have an anti-Semitism problem because Britain has an anti-Semitism problem. But it's also fucking clear that this is Tory Blairist fucking interference. But that would require familiarity. It would require like actual mass involvement in the Labour Party, which isn't a thing. It would require people to know all the people involved and to actually trust them. So it's a lot of this, like, I feel like this kind of like, you know, taking down an entire movement by just pushing out one tweet that accuses them of being fucking space reptiles or something is more possible when you don't have mass support and you don't have real trust in your institution, and would get proportionally less possible when the argument itself would be on its face fucking ridiculous, because people would know otherwise. Like, imagine somebody saying like, oh, at DSA meetings they set people on fire, and like, you know, if people go there, they're just like, no, I've never seen that happen. You know, like the accusation just falls fucking flat. But that would require mass involvement for that to really stick, because if you're not actually involved in it, it just sounds like everything else that's on TV. It's fucking fantasy. It's like somebody says, oh, wow, imagine this fantastical scenario. And you go, yep, cool, sounds good. That's information I can ingest. The other tiny little thought was like, you know, for like updating this kind of stuff is like, hey, podcasting. Imagine if Corbyn had a fucking Twitch channel and he was like streaming Fortnite every Saturday night. You know, would he not? Would that kind of shit not fucking work better than, you know, being aloof and distant in Parliament and so on? You know, and that's for one of the more personable sort of political figures. It's like this politics as this alienated sphere just isn't going to have this kind of like mass trust and mass support. You got to have this shit built up and have people instinctively not believe the horse shit.
Yeah, I mean, I think Corbyn would probably object to playing Fortnite on principle, as you consider it to be too violent and what is it? Jingoistic.
Sure.
Given that he's an incredibly obstinate person.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I can definitely concede the point that mass participation helps to amplify a variety. It can create trust. It can create linkages. But I do think there's, you know, cases you can think of where it's not a solution. So, for example, one example that came to my mind in this discussion was the situation in Portland. So Portland was used by Trump as, you know, a sort of straw man, right? Of Antifa is in the streets. They're destroying all that is sacred to our civilization. Blah blah blah. And to people in Portland, not only was that ridiculous, like the people who actually live in the city, not only was that messaging ridiculous, like they might not be the biggest fans of Antifa, but they can sure as hell say that, you know, what Trump was saying about Portland was manifestly false. And they not only didn't believe what Trump was saying, but they also resented being, you know, turned into a straw man for Trump's instrumental political purposes and having their city and their life slandered by this asshole with the bully pulpit and with Twitter, right? An incredible Twitter outreach because of it. And you know, be that as it may, that messaging was still effective because it's literally impossible for everyone in America to be a resident of Portland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
It's simply impossible. It cannot be done just because of physical reality. So there has to be some kind of messaging at a distance to counteract that. It can't simply be hands-on engagement, because it's not always possible for that to be the case. Like, now, if everybody was involved in an organization that was deeply connected to Portland and also other parts of, America, there could be internal messaging within that organization and similar life experiences among people that would push back against that kind of messaging. And indeed there was, right, to some degree. But, that messaging did reach some Americans. There's no doubt about it. That scapegoating Portland in that way was effective to some people.
I guess that latter example is more the thing I'm kind of getting at. Like, I mean, obviously you're going to have on the ground, direct, well, looking nice stuff. But like, I'm thinking, like, if there was a mass workers' party in the US, like, people in Tennessee would also probably not believe the slander. Like, you know what I mean? That sort of thing, right? Like, it's this, you'd have reason not to. This is the thing, is like, what are your priors on any nugget of bullshit information you get? Because maybe it's TV, it's Twitter, it's fantastical la la land, right? Like, somebody says, hey, what if fantastical scenario? And you go, yeah, sure. It sounds like everything else I've seen on TV, fantastical scenarios. But like, if you were in a workers' party and it was a real thing, you could be like, no, my priors on this are otherwise. Like, this is clearly nonsense. Yeah, it couldn't possibly rely on just direct, immediate, like, touching each other's faces sort of contact. But like real mass organization and mass participation, for sure.
Yeah. And well, I mean, in your internal messaging, your system too within that organization has to be reliable and not duplicitous, right? Because it's very easy for, say, oh yeah, I get, like, I'm a worker, I get my union newsletter at my workplace, but I don't believe it because of XYZ reason where I don't actually trust my leadership in my union.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's the real issue there. But Matt, go ahead.
Sort of, go on.
First up, death to England. That's very important. Also, also agree with the general thing of like, media has reach, but like, it's the weakest thing, like in your in how people like think of things. Because so if there are people who have like say on a matter but are like not connected to any alternate like thing that they trust more, like media, like that's how media narratives can really like shape people's brains. Because it is effective in agenda setting, just what issues are important to begin with, in sort of anchoring things, and also there's this thing there's a cognitive bias that basically makes you say that how often does this happen is how often I can easily recall a memory of it. And like media can really mess with that. That's part of why people are more afraid of car crashes, or people are more afraid of plane crashes than car crashes, even though car crashes are a million times more likely to kill you, but because plane crashes make the news. But the thing is, like, all that is outweighed if you know like one person, or like have one, organization that you're plugged into, that you trust more. I'm thinking about like, the indigenous communities, that Mass is involved with, like they're not going to believe, what BBC says or what the New York Times says. Like there's no amount of propaganda that can come out of them that's going to change what they think. Same thing with the authoritarian psychos who love Trump. It doesn't matter like how much of the rest of the world's media says that their cult leader is bad. Like they are plugged into a social context that that they trust more. So ultimately, a workers' party with its own prolet cult and its own press and its own media and everything, and organizations for people to be a part of that is just more influential than random news stories. Like that's ultimately the answer. Also, death to England.
I think, we could be optimistic for 2021 that maybe Britain will finally die. Yeah, I again, I think we need both sort of large scale communications approaches like the ones Beer is talking about here, as well as meaningful connection between people's lived experience and their political activities. They're both important. I just don't think we can completely substitute one for the other, because if you completely substitute in the media direction, you get like New Labor, right? And if you completely substitute in the opposite direction, I mean, you either get Cybersyn being overwhelmed in this way, or you get essentially localism. We can't fight on the media landscape, so we're going to do activity outside of it to the best of our ability. Okay. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just real quick. I have been seeing a lot of a reasonable amount of rumblings from, let's say, the progressive left media folks, like Jamel Bowie and Chris Hayes and what's his name, David Roberts, really trying to nail home the fact that the left in general just does not have neither the media capacity that the right has, nor do we have the sort of focus in messaging. So the information channels and the information content, right? The Democratic Party, I would say, or the establishment Democratic Party they don't have as much channels or outreach. They have their messaging, but their messaging, of course, is completely incapable of actually dealing with the variety of reality, right? Like their battle for the soul of America and all those platitudes that have no actual real information content, by definition, there can't actually govern or lead to any sort of govern or stability in the system. It's just noise, right? It's just nonsense. It's incredibly hard to conceive of how the broad left could develop those channels for communication to counter the right. There's certainly ways that we could do it. People like AOC are trying, but they single-handedly can't do it, of course. Podcasting isn't going to work. But, I don't know, Twitch streams, that's not going to work, right? What the right figured out is that you need something like Fox, which is sort of 90% of it. But then they reach out to YouTube and all the various ways that people are starting to consume stuff that the left might have it in disparate ways, but we don't have the consistent message to amplify across those either in a way that the right does. And in some ways, I think the left by nature can't do that, right? What we do is we split hairs and we fight with each other, and we wouldn't be the left if we didn't do that in many ways, right? And I think there's a positive spin to that, which is just that we can accurately or more accurately try to actually assess the reality of the situation and handle it in its variety more effectively, whereas the right only cares about a few things and they hammer it home and win people over, win all the people in rural Idaho over by talking about Portland on fire, that sort of thing. They can do it, but I don't know. It's clear the left needs better channel capacity and a better way of actually having messages that can amplify actual means of dealing with reality. And that's not going to come from the Democratic Party. That much is clear. And it's not clear where it can come from, because as soon as we sort of try to inject that into the system, it's we're just adding more noise and variety to everything. And I'm pessimistic of seeing a way out of it, I guess.
Well, I guess I would first of all say that it's very easy on the left to overstate the degree to which the right is unified. Because we don't see that on a daily basis, but actually there's a lot of backstabbing and squabbling and all these kinds of organizational divisions that happen in the right, they tend to be like, they have been a lot more successful at overcoming that, but I wouldn't, like, I don't buy the idea that the right is in lockstep unity, because that just is not true. Like, there's a lot of divisions on the right now, even if overall they seem to be winning politically.
I think, just to respond directly to that, like, I think that's true in some sense, but they also have a tendency to fall in line at some point in a way that the left doesn't, you know, and that's right.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, they have issues that they're able to more successfully fall in line around, I don't even think that has anything to do with authoritarianism, because there are plenty of authoritarians on the left. Like, plenty. No lack of them. So I don't think that's necessarily the cause. Ostensibly the left is about human liberation and, sort of achieving a post-state society, but actually we have many authoritarians on the left. They're really, and always have since the beginning of the left. That being said, like, I mean, I think an advantage we have on the left is that we have so many educated people who could work for us that are sympathetic to our causes, but ultimately we aren't able to pay them. So that's a problem. I mean, the whole education system in the universities tends to produce educated people who have at least some sympathy with what we're saying, and some antipathy towards what the right is saying. And so I don't consider, like, the march through the universities was not a success, but it did kind of produce some sort of capacities on our side. It's just, again, like, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Steve, when you were talking about consistency being a problem for us. Bernie was very good at consistency. He's just, he's the most boring speaker in the world because he only had like 3 things to talk about, and he just said them again and again and again and again and again and again and again. And occasionally that might have worked against him, but you can't fault him for not having consistency and not sort of like bulldozering through attempts to disrupt his message. So I do think that there's some value there. Shane, go ahead.
I still think Bernie's message would have worked better if he was streaming StarCraft 2 or something while he was a tiny micro remark here. I guess we sometimes or often hear this kind of thing of like, left media grift. Oh, it's not building revolution, whatever. We have to do protracted people's war. We have to really, go up into the mountains and just start abducting farmers and killing them or whatever. That's the real way to revolution, whatever. I think Beer's analysis here makes it more clear that even if we're a bit cool on the like active construction that this media thing can do, at the very minimum, we'll need this kind of media muscle to do countermeasures against fuckery. So that alone is enough to kind of justify building that kind of capacity, because we will be fucked with in this channel, and we'll need some sort of ability to respond to that, even if we don't think that having a Patreon is going to usher in the human emancipation or whatever directly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not under any delusions that our outreach as podcasters is sufficient. That's for damn sure. We don't have the resources for that. We just don't. We don't have the connections to influential people to get lots of people to recommend, or lots of people with sway to recommend our work, and we don't have the material resources to advertise. So you know, it's like
that one fucking.
I wouldn't say this is, you know, a cult. Yeah, we did one ad in Jacobin. Yeah, but
it ended up in the fucking Bernie issue.
Yeah, they put us in the margins.
Motherfuckers, they put us in the fold. It's barely.
Right, the fold. Yeah, that's right. That was very funny. Yeah, you know, I don't think what we're doing is useless here, but at the same time, I'm not under any delusions that this is a viable way to get like a, you know, an adequate amount of variety out there. Matt, go ahead.
No, with regard to like squabbling on the left versus, you know, like a kind of more unified right wing and liberals. I think so much of it is that like, you know, but like the left is still very much a subculture more than anything else right now, because you know, like the actual like, you know, struggle institutions were completely decimated by the Red Scare and Gladio and fucking Condor and other shit. Though I mean, you know, but especially like you know, in the U.S., like it is kind of still more a subculture than anything else, and you know, and that creates its own incentives. You know, you know, well, like making like a hyper specific brand makes a lot more sense if, you know, you're basically in the same job as like a music critic. Well, like that, then that makes sense. But you know, if it's hooked up to actual organizing, then there's actual reasons to put aside your differences. But I mean, if all you're doing is discourse, then why would you ever put aside your differences? You know, your differences and going at your differences are like that's actually your whole thing. And so, but you know, flip side is, you know, one thing I think, you know, the left media ecosystem is really good for is, you know, like just like getting organizing on people's radar. Like, I mean, I have a really stupid origin story. Like, I started listening to Chapo, and then I learned that DSA was a thing, and then I just kept my eye open for, you know, like, oh, yeah, maybe I should join this one of these days. And yeah, like yeah, just getting people looking for an on-ramp who don't necessarily like have like an easy way to jump in, I think is useful. But yeah, I mean, it's got to loop back to organizing. You know, it'll be a lot more serious when there is work to get back to. Like that's when you can put aside your differences and get back to work, when there is actually an organizing project to do.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's one reason why the Democratic messaging is somewhat effective, is that there are, like, when election time, like, so outside of election time, there are a lot of grassroots organizations that are affiliated with the Democratic Party, which people can get involved in, but I think that's, you know, quite marginal in terms of actual engagement. But during election time, there's a machine, and you can go out and you can participate in it, and the messaging has some accordance with what you're actually doing. And you know, like, for the most part, our podcast said nothing about the election because there was nothing to say about the election that would be anything more than the kind of, you know, left discourse position mongering that you're talking about, Matt. Which is I don't think is actually constructive unless you actually have a position to defend that's worth something. But when, you know, it's Biden versus Trump, it's like, well, there's nothing to say. So there's a clear disconnect between what we could say and what people would actually be involved with on the ground there. Yeah. So anyway. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Definitely appreciate all of your points of view here. It was quite a lively conversation, and I expect we're going to see more of that when we get to Beer's suggestions, if not actual, like, hard programmatic conclusions about what to do about this media problem. Because I think that, as Jeremy has said, in the final chapter, Beer hits on this pretty hard. So, yeah, thanks, everyone. And I will see you next week for more reading.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. It's been great.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Bye.